The moment Richard Langford said, "This entire project would take only half the time if my son handled it," the conference room atmosphere curdled instantly. The silence was so profound and hostile I could hear my pulse thrumming in my teeth. I was seated at the far end of the long, polished mahogany table, the sole woman representing the operational side of the business in that high-stakes board meeting. Every head angled subtly, clinically toward me. They attempted to frame it as a neutral observation, a simple statement of efficiency. It was nothing of the kind. It was a perfectly aimed shot fired across the bow. Elias Mercer, the founder and CEO of Windhaven Systems, leaned back in his leather chair, his expression utterly motionless, without so much as a blink. The board members waited for him, holding their breath the way people wait for a judge to read a final sentence. But he offered no immediate reaction. Not yet. Richard folded his hands on the table's surface, staring straight down the length of it at me. "Connor understands the pace our clients expect," he continued, layering the insult. "Bella's approach is methodical." His voice curled around that final word, methodical, like it was the most damning flaw a high-performing executive could possess. Connor Langford sat 2 seats away from his father, dressed in a fresh, bespoke suit. His jawline clearly rehearsed, bearing the kind of smug, entitled smile that only blossoms on someone who has never been forced to earn a thing the hard way. When our eyes met, he had the audacity to lift one eyebrow, already measuring the space I would leave open upon my exit. I felt the crisp edges of the resignation letter resting in my notebook long before my fingers brushed against it. I had printed it late the night before, not because I wanted to quit the company I had helped build, but because I understood the volatile terrain I was standing on. Richard had been maneuvering for weeks, and the hard slam of judgment in his voice only confirmed the successful culmination of his plan. I stood slowly, deliberately. The slightest tremor would have been interpreted as weakness. "If you want your son to handle it," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even, devoid of accusation or anger, "then this belongs to you." I placed the neatly folded letter onto the cold, dark wood of the table. Connor's smile widened, sharp and openly triumphant. Elias Mercer finally broke the silence. "Fine," he said, his voice cool, deep, and utterly unreadable. "Give the project to his son." Richard Langford let out a deep exhale, the sound of a man who believed he had won a significant battle. Connor straightened imperceptibly in his chair, basking in the success. Then Elias turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the room until it locked onto mine. "Bella," he said, the command in his tone undeniable. "Meet me in 10 minutes. Bring that resignation letter with you." His voice did not reveal anger. It didn't reveal sympathy. It revealed nothing at all. And somehow, that total absence of emotion was far worse than outright hostility. I stepped out of the boardroom with the letter still clutched tightly in my hand, accompanied by the unsettling certainty that whatever decision awaited me behind Elias Mercer's closed door was going to change far more than my job title. When I first moved to Portland 10 years ago, fresh out of business school with a hunger for structure, I never imagined I would end up sitting in boardrooms where someone else's fragile ego or nepotistic ambition decided the objective value of my operational work. I arrived with one well-worn suitcase, a used laptop, and the kind of stubborn, almost naive belief that if I simply worked hard enough and accurately enough, I could build a life that felt stable and defensible. Windhaven Systems was supposed to be the keystone of that stability. During my early years there, Richard Langford barely acknowledged my existence. If he passed me in the hallway, he might grant a curt, fractional nod before sweeping past. Back then, his indifference was 1,000 times easier to stomach than the calculated malice that arrived later. "Bella, you always know exactly which fire to put out first." My former director, Lacey Monroe, had told me that during a particularly brutal quarter, and she truly meant it. During the pandemic, when every system we managed buckled simultaneously, I spent 14-hour days stitching together the failing workflows that kept 2 critical contracts alive. Lacey called me her anchor, the non-negotiable stabilizing force. Richard, observing from a safe distance, called it luck. That was the first time I realized definitively that we lived in entirely different realities. Connor entered the company shortly thereafter. Richard introduced him at a staff meeting with a proprietary, proud hand resting heavily on his shoulder. Fresh eyes, he'd announced, looking directly at me, implying that youth alone could effortlessly replace a decade of hard-won experience. Connor shook my hand with a smile that was clearly practiced, not genuine. "I've heard your operations work is steady," he drawled, and the microscopic, telling pause before the final word conveyed everything I needed to know about his attitude toward my professional competence. It did not take long for the small, insidious shifts to begin. A vital planning meeting that should have included the operations director suddenly no longer required an operations presence. A detailed report I wrote came back from Richard's desk with entire sections rewritten and my name excised from the authorship. Data I had carefully verified was subtly altered before it reached the board, conveniently softening Connor's amateur mistakes while aggressively erasing my corrective fixes. When I mentioned the pattern to my immediate team, Jake leaned in and lowered his voice in the break room. "We see it, Bella. We know what they're doing. We just can't push back right now. You know how Richard works." I knew, and I felt the professional ground beginning its slow, dangerous tilt beneath me long before Richard attempted to push me out completely. The only thing I didn't know then was the precise moment Richard decided that removing me was worth risking the entire company's structural integrity. Connor Langford didn't walk into Windhaven Systems. He claimed it, acting as though the building had been constructed specifically for his benefit. He had the expensive degree, the last name that opened closed doors faster than any resume, and the polished, expectant smile of someone who had never had the misfortune of hearing the word no. His handshake was firm, practiced, and utterly empty of genuine connection. "Looking forward to learning from you," he told me during his first week. Yet the superior way he delivered the line made it abundantly clear that he fully expected the learning process to be optional for him. The hostile takeover began quietly. A strategic report I had finalized came back from him with red notes scribbled aggressively across the margins. "Just tightening the language," he'd said with a dismissive wave, even though his revisions introduced numerous fundamental errors that I later had to silently correct. In a subsequent team meeting, I was presenting the updated, crucial workflow that I had spent weeks developing. Connor abruptly jumped in before I could even finish the third slide. "Actually, I walked the team through this on Monday," he announced, completely usurping my presentation. The room flicked their eyes nervously toward me. Jake opened his mouth, ready to correct the lie, but I subtly shook my head. It wasn't yet worth humiliating Connor in front of everyone. Not yet. A few days later, one of my sharpest analysts, Mariah, caught me outside the break room. "Connor pulled us aside," she whispered, anxiety etched on her face. "He said the company needs fresher thinking. He specifically said you were steady but old school." I felt the sting of the blatant sexism deep in my throat, but I kept my voice calm and low. "Thank you for telling me." The more Connor pushed boundaries and fabricated success, the more Richard Langford praised him publicly. "He sees the future," Richard crowed in one meeting, tapping Connor's shoulder possessively. "We simply cannot cling to outdated methods." Suddenly, board members started echoing the exact phrases Richard used, almost verbatim. *modernization, new leadership energy, cutting dead weight. Their eyes inevitably drifted toward me each time. I immediately started documenting everything meticulously. Every email, every discrepancy, every altered timestamp, every conversation. I didn't yet know precisely what specific piece of evidence I would eventually need. I only knew that the ground was shifting faster than I could hold it steady. Richard was no longer treating me like a valued employee. He was treating me like an obstacle to be systematically eliminated, and I desperately needed to understand why he felt so profoundly threatened by me that he was willing to rewrite the company's entire operational narrative. Richard's first highly selective performance update landed in my inbox on a humid Thursday morning. The subject line was blandly neutral, but the content itself was anything but. My name appeared only once, tucked into a tiny, almost invisible bullet point at the bottom of the second page. *operation support provided as needed. *I stared at the sentence for a long moment, the vague description a total erasure of my responsibilities, before forwarding it to my team. Jake responded almost immediately, his message clipped with frustration. Asterisk, where are the risk mitigation metrics and the salvage work on the 2 COVID contracts? Asterisk, I typed back just 2 words. Asterisk, ask Richard. Asterisk, I knew he wouldn't dare. At the next leadership meeting, Richard projected the surgically revised report onto the large screen. As you can see, he said, tapping the slide with a laser pointer, process inefficiencies clearly stem from outdated workflows. Bella's methods worked years ago, but current volume demands a different approach now. I kept my eyes fixed on the grain of the conference table. Outdated workflows was the new, simple code word for anything Bella built or managed. Connor leaned forward with an air of practiced, faux modesty. I've been testing a new pipeline, he chimed in. With enough support, we can easily shave weeks off delivery timelines. One of the board members, Helen Rodas, nodded approvingly. Speed is absolutely what matters now. I spoke quietly, but ensured my voice carried the firmness of objective data. Speed without contractual accuracy puts us at severe risk. Several steps Connor removed are explicitly required in the client contract documentation. Richard's smile tightened, dissolving into a hard line. Contracts can be renegotiated. They can, I agreed, meeting his gaze evenly, but not without fully disclosing operational changes, especially those tied to regulatory compliance. For a tense moment, the entire room held its collective breath. Then another board member, seemingly prompted, chimed in, repeating Richard's earlier, corrosive phrasing. We need modernization, not resistance. There it was, the chilling echo I had feared. Words do not travel that quickly or uniformly through a board unless they have been systematically planted and rehearsed. Through all of this calculated theater, Elias Mercer sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression an absolute cipher. He neither agreed nor disagreed with Richard. He simply watched, observing the dynamics unfold. By the end of the meeting, the professional damage was clear and widespread. The board didn't just hear Richard's arguments. They believed his carefully constructed narrative. And Elias's silence meant he saw exactly what was happening, the calculated deception and manipulation, but was choosing, for reasons unknown, not to intervene yet. I left the room wondering what strategic purpose that formidable silence served, and why he seemed intent on watching exactly how far Richard would push his campaign of sabotage. Elias Mercer's office door was already partially open when I approached, the folded resignation letter now feeling hot and heavy in my hand. He didn't gesture for me to sit down. He simply looked at me, his face utterly devoid of emotion. Close the door, Bella. I did. My palms were damp, the letter almost warm from how tightly I had been gripping it. He nodded toward it. You brought that this morning. Yes. Why? His voice was even not accusing, almost strangely curious. I met his unwavering eyes. Because Richard has been clearing the path for Connor for months. Today wasn't a spontaneous observation, Mr. Mercer. And if I stayed silent any longer, I was going to become the necessary excuse they needed to tear the entire project apart and blame operations for the failure. Elias studied me for a long time, his analytical gaze penetrating. What do you think Connor cannot handle? I didn't soften the truth, knowing he demanded clarity above all else. The dependencies, the contractual layers, the risk structures I negotiated during the most unstable years of the pandemic. There are crucial workflows that only make sense because of how they were built step by step, with the client's priorities and regulatory requirements factored in. Remove the wrong step, and the entire thing collapses instantly. He exhaled slowly, a soft, deliberate sound. I suspected as much. My pulse immediately jumped, startled. Suspected what? That Richard has been falsifying progress data, he stated plainly, leaning forward slightly. Glossing over Connor's mistakes, presenting selective, manipulated metrics. The underlying numbers did not align with my private projections, but I needed confirmation. He tapped the surface of his desk once. I held my breath, waiting. And now you have it. He nodded, his eyes sharpening with intent. I do. For a long, significant moment he said nothing more. Then, he opened a desk drawer and slid a heavy, engraved business card across the polished surface toward me. North River Analytics. They are one of our most critical strategic partners. I frowned, confused by the abrupt shift in topic. You want me to go work for them? I want you where Richard cannot manipulate you or the outcome, he corrected, his eyes fixed on mine. If you resign, I will accept it, but your work, specifically your structural accuracy, is far too important to be buried under his petty politics. The card felt strangely heavier than paper should, weighted down by strategic intent. Elias's decision wasn't a dismissal. It was a highly calculated move on a corporate chessboard that I hadn't even realized we were both standing on. I knew I needed to understand why he wanted me outside the protective walls of the company before the full consequences of Richard's deceit hit Windhaven. North River Analytics welcomed me with polite, slightly strained smiles and a stack of confidential documents that was easily taller than my forearm. My short-term contract was officially framed as a neutral operational review. But the way their director, Dana Caldwell, looked at me told a far different story. We truly appreciate you stepping in, Dana said, handing me the first massive binder. Windhaven's reports haven't aligned with our projections for months. Elias said you're the only person who can clarify the gaps. Asterisk the only person. Asterisk those words tightened something profoundly in my chest. I sat down at a small auxiliary table near Dana's office and opened the top file. The very first page showed a familiar timeline, my original workflow from Windhaven. But the next few pages were demonstrably violently wrong. Essential steps had been removed, milestones relabeled under different names, and the financial numbers smoothed into suspiciously neat, impossible patterns. I flagged one particular line and called Dana over immediately. Where did this specific document come from? Richard sent it, she confirmed. He claimed the Windhaven operations team approved the adjustments for speed. I kept my voice steady, betraying none of the internal shock. I never approved any of this documentation. She frowned, genuinely confused. Then why does his official report claim you streamlined these processes? Because he needed Connor to look like a miracle worker, I thought, but I did not say it aloud yet. 2 hours later, Dana returned with another dense file, her expression now deeply worried. Bella, look at these data logs. They don't match your original system dependencies at all. She was right. They didn't. The logs, which were timestamped as evidence of Connor's efficiency breakthroughs, were identical copies of high-risk operational drafts I had written months earlier, drafts I had explicitly decided to never release due to the built-in liabilities. I immediately called Jake at Windhaven. Did Richard access my archived files? There was a long, noticeable hesitation on the line. Bella, he asked for credential overrides, said it was for a board audit. I didn't think. It's fine, I said quietly, though my entire professional life was suddenly flashing before my eyes. When I hung up, my hands were trembling with cold clarity. North River's documents weren't revealing a simple misunderstanding. They were revealing a cold, deliberate pattern of corporate fraud. Richard hadn't just altered reports. He had meticulously rewritten the truth brick by brick, hiding something far deeper and darker. And whatever he was hiding was dangerous enough to risk destabilizing the very company he claimed to protect. By the third day at North River, the files stopped whispering and started screaming the truth. Every document I opened pointed back to the same architect of deception, Richard Langford. I laid 3 crucial reports side by side on the table. Dana hovered quietly behind me as I traced a line with my index finger. This projection, I said, tapping the first page, is built entirely on Connor's supposedly improved throughput. Dana leaned closer. But this log, she tapped the second page, shows the original error streak. It shows my error streak. I corrected her, because this was my preliminary draft, full of high-risk scenarios. Connor copied it, removed the error notes, and simply changed the timestamps to present it as new, optimized data. She sucked in a quick breath. How many instances? Enough to make blatant incompetence look like strategic brilliance. The next file was worse. It contained numerous budget reallocations I had never authorized. Tens of thousands of dollars shifted into Connor's pilot project. I flipped to the final summary page. Here, I showed her. He wrote that the savings came directly from my department's budget efficiency. That is physically impossible given our fixed costs. Dana's voice dropped to a shocked whisper. Bella, this is intentional manipulation. I nodded grimly. He inflated Connor's performance metrics and systematically buried every resulting mistake under my name, under my professional liability. And Richard Langford approved all of it. Dana stepped out of the room and returned moments later with the compliance lead. Marcus. North River Systems flags serious inconsistencies. Marcus stated, his face grave. Your findings triggered an automatic internal audit review. I didn't celebrate the victory. I didn't gloat. I simply handed him the heavily flagged folder. These are the documented discrepancies. Use them however protocol requires. He scanned the pages quickly and let out a low, involuntary whistle. This isn't just sloppy work. This is deliberate, systematic manipulation of financial data. Send it to Elias Mercer, I instructed, my voice firm, and send it to the entire board. They need to see the truth as it is without any filters. Marcus nodded decisively. We will send the packet today. By late afternoon, North River's formal audit packet, complete with signatures, confirmed timestamps, and confirmation that the altered files originated under Richard's authorization, was already en route to Windhaven Systems. The fragile facade Richard had painstakingly built, slide by slide, meeting by meeting, was finally coming apart under its own undeniable weight. One way or another, Richard was going to have to face the truth he had buried so carelessly. The emergency meeting happened less than 24 hours after North River sent the devastating audit. I was not invited, but Jake called me the moment he stepped out of the boardroom, his voice tight and breathless. Bella, it was a disaster, he whispered into the phone. I could hear other voices behind him, raised, frantic, clearly cracking under intense pressure. Then Elias's voice cut through the chaos, steady, deep, and chillingly cold. Richard, explain these discrepancies. There was a rustle, a pathetic stammer. Then Richard's strained reply. Those logs were taken completely out of context. Elias did not soften his tone. North River traced the altered files to your authorization and system credentials. This is not context, Richard. This is control. Another voice, Helen Rhodes from the board, sharpened the blow. You misled us, Richard. For months. Connor tried to desperately jump in. Dad didn't mislead anyone. The data was misinterpreted by the client. Sit down, Connor. Elias's command was immediate and absolute, devoid of anger, just pure, heavy authority. Your revised workflow collapsed the minute Bella stepped out of the company. The audit shows you removed required operational steps from a federally monitored contract. Connor's breath caught sharply over the phone line. She could have helped if she hadn't quit. Helen immediately cut him off. She quit because the two of you systematically pushed her out. Jake whispered the confirmation to me. Bella, you should have seen their faces. Another board member spoke next, the decision clearly finalized. Connor will step down from all project authority, effective immediately. Connor sputtered in outrage. You can't do that. Elias overrode him completely. And Richard Langford is suspended, pending a full internal investigation. The room fell into a long, heavy, echoing silence. I could almost feel it through the telephone line. Fortunes shifting, reputations cracking like fragile glass under immense weight. Then Helen Rhodes said something I truly did not expect to hear. We owe Bella Harrington a profound apology. Jake audibly exhaled into the receiver. They all nodded, Bella. Even Elias. I pressed my hand against my chest, physically grounding myself, keeping my voice steady and professional. Noted. I ended the call quickly before the flood of emotion. Relief, sadness, vindication could spill over. Justice was finally unfolding, but I still did not know what that meant for my future. Elias chose a small, unremarkable cafe near the Willamette River, a deliberate distance from Windhaven's imposing glass walls and sterile conference rooms. When I walked in, he was already seated at a corner table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Bella, sit." I did, maintaining a steady, professional posture, even though my nerves were humming intensely beneath my skin. He folded his hands precisely. "You handled this entire situation with remarkable discipline." I met his eyes steadily. "I simply handled the truth. That was all that was required." "That," he said quietly, a faint acknowledgement in his voice, "was exactly what I needed you to do." I frowned slightly. "You needed me to leave Windhaven?" "I needed you outside Richard's sphere of reach," he replied without hesitation. "If you stayed, he would have buried you under enough false trails and politically motivated counteraccusations to confuse even the board. North River was the only place he could not tamper with your objective work or its results." I let the weight of that statement settle. The resignation that had felt like the bitter end of my career had, in fact, been part of a much larger tactical plan, one I hadn't known I was part of until this very moment. Elias leaned forward slightly. "Accuracy has always been your core strength. You do not inflate numbers. You do not chase politics. You simply operate in truth, and that kind of clarity is rare in our industry." I stayed silent, waiting patiently for the conclusion. He placed a thick folder onto the table between us. "This is a contract, long-term, independent. You would consult for North River, and for me directly, not as an employee, as a partner." The word partner landed like a steady, surprising pulse in my chest. "A partner," I repeated, tasting the implication. "Yes." Elias nodded. "You will lead the operational architecture for the crucial intercompany initiatives we begin next quarter. No internal sabotage, no political interference, and full, decisive autonomy." I breathed in slowly, letting the new weight of the offer fill me. This was not a forced return to Windhaven. This was not a second chance inside a toxic environment. This was something entirely different. Something that didn't require me to shrink my competence in order to survive. "I'll review the contract tonight," I said. Elias allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Take your time. This is your future to choose." As I left the cafe, walking back toward the sunlight reflecting off the river, I realized that the personal vindication I had imagined, walking back into Windhaven victorious, was far too small and petty for the life that was now rapidly opening in front of me. I signed the consulting contract with North River on a quiet Tuesday morning. There was no ceremony, no handshakes beyond Dana's genuinely warm smile. The simple signature felt less like closure and more like oxygen finally reaching a vital part of me I had starved for too long. Later that afternoon, as I reviewed the first phase of Elias's upcoming initiative, Jake called. His voice was steady and calm in a way I had not heard in weeks. "It's official," he said immediately. "Richard's suspension became a full termination today. Connor's out too. They said the falsified reports were enough to void any appeal." I exhaled slowly, watching the city traffic move outside the window. It was their doing, Jake, not mine. "I know," he replied instantly. "Everyone knows. The company is completely restructuring. Compliance is rewriting half the policies, and there's talk of a major audit overhaul. People keep saying that your resignation didn't break Windhaven. The lies about you did." He hung up after promising to stay in close touch. I sat back in my chair, letting the finality of the words settle deep inside. For the first time in a long time, I felt neither vindicated nor angry. I felt free. Elias stopped by North River later that week. He didn't bother knocking. He simply appeared at the doorway with that familiar, unreadable calm of his. "Settling in?" "I am," I confirmed. "Good," he replied, folding his arms. "There's a second contract coming after this one. Larger. You'll lead it." I nodded, feeling a quiet confidence settle over me. "I'm ready." As he departed, I realized how strange and fundamentally restorative it was to be truly valued without having to constantly defend my professional place at the table. I did not need to return to Windhaven to prove anything. Not to the board, not to the people who had doubted me, and certainly not to the entitled fools who tried to replace me with shortcuts and last names. I walked out of the office and into the late afternoon light, the energy of the city humming around me. I hadn't rebuilt what Windhaven systems had tried to take. I had built something entirely different, something autonomous, strategic, and completely belonging to me. They once relied on my expertise and pretended they didn't. Now they would rely on the systems I created, the structures I designed, without ever being able to touch or undermine me again.